Welcome to a night of spine-chilling tales that will make your skin crawl and your heart race. Tonight, we're diving into the eerie and unexplained. 15 terrifying Halloween stories that blur the line between reality and the supernatural. From haunted hayrides to sinister phone calls, each story gets more disturbing as we go. So grab your popcorn, turn off the lights, and get ready for a journey into the unknown. But be warned, once you start watching, you won't be able to look away. Stay with us until the end, if you dare. I was 22 years old, attending a Halloween party at my former best friend Nick's house. Nick died of a heroin overdose in 2013. Before his death, he would throw big Halloween parties every year at his house, as his parents routinely flew to New York each year to attend their own friend's party. Nick was always a big Halloween freak, so the whole house was filled with truly horrifying props that we all knew Nick spent way too much money on. He even put up giant walls of cardboard and covered them with wallpaper to create a haunted maze of sorts. I want to keep this story PG-13 rated, so I'll skip the weed, beer, LSD, and sex, and get right to the part where things went bad. I'll admit we weren't in our right minds. None of us were. Anyone who came to Nick's parties knew what went down. Me, Nick, and a few other guys, Vinny G, Joey, and Q, were upstairs in Nick's room, smoking a bong, when we heard two steady, loud bangs come from downstairs. Nick clumsily, but panicking, rushed to open the door to see what was going on. There were sounds of screaming from both guys and girls. I remember quite clearly. It sounded as if a crowd of people were screaming for their lives down there. We all called Nick to come back in and shut the door. Even under the influence of drugs, we all knew what was going on. Nick ran back inside and shut the door quickly, but also quietly, locking it behind him. He turned to us with the facial expression of someone who had just witnessed a murder. "What did you see? What's going on?" We all shouted at him. He told us to hide before anything else, and we all knew why. From that point on, we didn't ask questions. Nick hit the lights and hid in the closet with Joey, while I hid under the bed with Q, and Vinny G hid in the storage box. We could hear the blasting music from downstairs turn off, followed by a grown man screaming at everyone to shut up. One unfortunate girl let out a scream of shock and fear, and after another bang, silence. The man started shouting at everyone again, but I couldn't hear it too well, and I certainly wouldn't remember exactly what he was shouting. We heard two other men shouting. By now, there were a confirmed 3 intruders in the house, but there could have been more for all we knew at that point. We heard the sound of boots stomping up the stairs, and then coming halfway down the hall, stopping outside the bedroom door. The intruder on the other side of the door tried the doorknob, but when he realized it was locked, he started ramming into the door, most likely with his shoulder. After a few failed attempts, the sound of a few shots to the doorknob was clearly enough to break the lock, allowing the door to swing open. We heard cries from downstairs after the shots to the doorknob, followed by silence and gunshots. Nick and I had our hands over our mouths to shield our breathing noises. I watched through the transparent cloth that hung from the bottom of Nick's bed as the black boots with overlapping ripped denim jeans moved instinctively to the closet. He opened the door, and I could hear Nick begging the intruder not to kill him, offering a generous amount of money if they would leave. Nick gave himself up as the house owner. That's when the intruder ordered him downstairs. The rest of us stayed put. Apparently, Joey hadn't been caught with Nick. We stayed under the bed, shaking and afraid. There was near silence from downstairs, other than Nick talking with the intruders, but whatever they were saying was too low for us to hear. It felt like nearly 20 minutes before the front door slammed shut, and Nick came running back upstairs to tell us they were gone. I think the most horrifying moment of my life was when I stepped downstairs, back into the living room, and saw the 2 dead bodies lying lifelessly on the ground. Blood was spewing out from their heads, Jen and Robbie, 2 good friends that I still miss. I'll spare you the details of what happened when the police arrived. But despite the fact that the house smelled like a marijuana greenhouse, the police were more interested in finding out who the masked men were that killed 2 innocent college students. Oh yeah, Nick told the four of us who were hiding in his room that there were 4 intruders in total, all wearing fedoras, vendetta masks, coats, and gloves. They demanded $100,000 in cash, and when Nick couldn't provide it, they demanded he fill their empty sack with his most valued possessions. All the partygoers held hostage in the room were also forced to throw their wallets into the sack, or they would be shot. After the incident, Nick became depressed. He started drinking too much, becoming an alcoholic. He stopped showing up to school and ultimately ended up dropping out. He started using heavier drugs, such as meth and heroin. I had one good talk with him after the incident, and he was more real during this talk than he had ever been. He told me, with tears rolling down his cheeks and a pipe in his hand, that he lived in constant pain, knowing he caused the death of 2 of his best friends. Nick died of a heroin overdose in July of 2013, not even a year after the incident. It was my first Halloween living in my own house, away from my parents. I live in a small corner house with a basement but no upstairs, a house my parents paid half for. It was 11 o'clock at night, and I was sitting in the living room, watching scary Halloween movies, when I found myself getting up to answer a knock at the door. But then I stopped and thought, who could be at the door at 11 o'clock p.m.? Surely there were no more trick-or-treaters out. I had a pretty good feeling it was a late-night Halloween ding-dong ditcher, so I gave it a second, then shot a glance to the porch through the window. They were gone already. Yep, ding-dong ditchers. I sat back down, not thinking twice about it, and again, knocking at the front door. "Get lost!" I yelled. I was not in the mood for punky kids. They ignored my demands and started pounding now, not just knocking. I was pissed. I leaped up and swung the door open. No one was there. Once again, I slipped on my shoes and headed outside to begin searching the bushes for the kids, but there was nobody in sight. Not in the bushes, not behind my car, not across the street. I was done answering. I didn't want to feed into their fun anymore. So I went back inside, double-locked the door, and went to my bedroom, also locking that door just to feel safer, I guess. Even over the TV, I could still hear the stupid kids pounding on my front door repeatedly. I was so close to calling the cops to get them away, but that would undoubtedly lead to my house being egged or TP'd. The pounding continued for an uncomfortably long time, more than half an hour. I thought, these kids must be filming something for YouTube and were desperate for a reaction. But I wasn't going to give it to them. At some point, I dozed off with the TV on, only to wake up to the knocking again. I looked at the clock. It was 2 in the morning. How could those kids still be at it? I thought. I turned off the TV and sat up with my ears open for a few moments. My heart completely stopped as I realized the knocking was not at my front door, but rather at my bedroom door. I jumped out of bed, looking around my room like a madman for something to use as a weapon. They knew I was awake now. They were trying the doorknob, trying to bust down the door. These weren't any kids. By some miracle, I came up with an idea. It was a long shot, but it was all I could think of. I turned on the receiver to my speaker system, plugged in my iPhone, brought up the YouTube app, typed in 45 gunshot sound effect, turned on the volume, and pressed play. The sound of a gunshot echoed out of the speakers. It sounded real enough. I paused the video after the first shot and yelled, "That was a warning shot. Leave now, or I won't hesitate to shoot you in the head." And it worked. I heard 2 pairs of footsteps stomping over my wood floors and out the front door. I gave it a moment before opening my bedroom door and peeking outside. They were gone, but the front door was left wide open. I quickly shut it, called the police, and that's where my story ended. So I was never really a big Halloween person, mostly because I grew up without many friends. Once I passed the age of 10, I couldn't use the excuse of going with my mom anymore, and it's not like I had friends to go with. So this last Halloween, I was 14 years old. I do have a little sister who's only 8, so my mom went trick-or-treating with her. My one really good friend, Steve, already had plans, and I didn't want to impose, so it didn't seem like I'd be trick-or-treating this year. I felt a tiny part of me explode with happiness on the inside when my mom asked me if I'd like to hand out candy while she and my sister went out to trick-or-treat. So that's what I did, and I really enjoyed it, to be honest. The night started slow, but once it was around 6:30, kids and their parents started pouring in by the dozens. I was handing out candy left and right. Everybody was having a great time, and after the waves of children started to die down, it was already almost 8 o'clock. I figured it was time to start closing up shop. I shut off the front porch lights and went upstairs to my room. I started doing my homework on my computer while simultaneously watching videos on YouTube. It was 8:30 when I heard the doorbell ring. I ignored it. It was late, and all the kids should have gone home by now, I thought. But whoever it was started to pound on the door. My whole body jumped in the chair as I didn't know what to do. I rushed to my mom's room and picked up the phone, dialing her number. My mom picked up, and I explained how someone was pounding on the door. She said she'd be home as soon as possible and to just stay in her room. I heard the front door open and was relieved that it was just my mom coming in. I yelled from the room, "Mom, you scared me!" But no one responded. Then I realized she wouldn't have had time to get back yet. My breathing grew heavier. I took out my phone and called my mom again. She told me they were still a few blocks away and would be back in a few minutes. I was petrified, and then I started to hear footsteps coming up the stairs. I told my mom what was happening. She said to stay calm, that she'd call the police, and to hide in the closet. There was nowhere to hide in my mom's room. So I quietly opened her bedroom door and peered out into the hallway. I saw a man walking up the stairs, but when he saw me, he just turned around and ran out the front door. I had no idea what had just happened. My mom and sister got home only a minute or two after the guy had left. I explained to her what happened. My mom kept asking what the guy looked like, but I didn't really get a good look at him. I just remember he was kind of tall and had on a dark hooded sweatshirt. This happened last year on Halloween night. I was 12 years old, and my parents were going out for Halloween, so I was in charge of taking my little sister, Emily, out trick-or-treating. We left at around 7 o'clock p.m., and everything was going pretty normal at first. We were making our rounds through the neighborhood when I noticed a man following us. I didn't think much of it at first. He could have just been going to the same houses as us. But after about 15 minutes, I noticed he wasn't even ringing doorbells. He was just following us. I started to get nervous and grabbed Emily's hand, telling her it was time to go home. She protested, wanting to keep trick-or-treating, but I insisted. We started walking faster, and so did the man. I was really scared now. I pulled Emily behind a house and we hid in the backyard. We waited for what felt like hours before the man finally walked past us. We stayed hidden until we were sure he was gone. When we finally got home, I told my parents what happened, and they called the police. The police took a report, but I never heard anything more about it. Emily was too young to understand how serious it was, but I was terrified. I was just thankful we made it home safely. When I was 15, I lived with my dad and my little sister in a small town. It was Halloween night, and I was supposed to be watching my sister while my dad was at work. But my friend Steve called and asked if I wanted to go to a Halloween party, so I left my sister at home. I was only gone for a couple of hours, but when I got back, I found my sister crying in her room. She told me that while I was gone, 2 boys from our neighborhood, who were about 17 years old, had come over. They said they were looking for me, but when my sister told them I wasn't home, they asked if they could wait for me inside. My sister let them in, and they stayed for a while, just hanging out. But then one of them asked if he could use the bathroom. My sister showed him where it was, and a few minutes later, she heard him calling her from my dad's room. When she went in, she found him and his friend going through my dad's closet. They were holding some of my sister's underwear. My sister freaked out and ran out of the room. The boys chased after her, but she managed to lock herself in her room. She said they tried to get in for a while, but eventually, they left. I was furious. I told my dad what happened when he got home, and he called the boys' parents. They came over the next day and apologized, saying it was just a prank. My dad didn't press charges, but he told them if they ever came near my sister again, he would. I had just moved into a new house with my family. It was an old, creaky place with a lot of history, but it was affordable, and my parents loved it. At first, everything seemed normal. We spent the first few days unpacking and settling in, but then strange things started happening. It started with small things: doors closing on their own, lights flickering, and footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. My parents brushed it off as the house settling, but I was scared. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard something in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a tall figure standing by my bed. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could tell it wasn't my parents. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or scream. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, the figure just disappeared. I ran to my parents' room and told them what happened. They tried to calm me down, saying it was just a bad dream, but I knew it wasn't. I refused to sleep in my room after that, and my parents eventually agreed to let me sleep in their room until we could figure out what was going on. The strange occurrences continued for weeks. My parents finally decided to call in a paranormal investigator, but before they could, we moved out of the house. We never found out what was haunting that place, but I still get chills thinking about it. My friends and I used to love playing pranks on each other. It was all in good fun, and no one ever got hurt. But last Halloween, things went too far. We were at a Halloween party at our friend's house, and someone had the idea to pull a prank on one of the guys who had just arrived. The plan was simple. We would hide in the dark, jump out, and scare him. We all thought it would be hilarious. So we hid in the bushes near the front door and waited for him to come outside. When he did, we jumped out and screamed. But instead of laughing, he pulled out a knife and slashed at us. We all scattered, terrified. We had no idea he was carrying a knife. We later found out that he had been mugged a few months before and was still paranoid. He thought we were trying to rob him. Thankfully, no one was seriously hurt, but it was a close call. We all realized how stupid we had been and vowed never to play pranks like that again. When I was in high school, my friends and I used to dare each other to do stupid things all the time. One Halloween, we dared our friend Mike to spend the night in the old cemetery on the edge of town. The cemetery was supposed to be haunted, and no one ever went there after dark. Mike accepted the dare, saying he wasn't afraid of ghosts. We all went with him to the cemetery and set up a tent for him. Then we left him there and went back to one of our houses to hang out. We figured he would chicken out and come back in a few hours, but he didn't. The next morning, we went back to the cemetery to see if he had made it through the night. We found the tent empty. Mike was nowhere to be found. We searched the entire cemetery but couldn't find him. We were starting to get really worried when he suddenly appeared from behind one of the gravestones. He looked pale and shaken, but he wouldn't tell us what had happened. He just kept saying he didn't want to talk about it. We never got the full story out of him, but whatever happened that night, it scared him enough that he never accepted another dare from us again. When I was a kid, there was this urban legend about a girl who had disappeared on Halloween night. The story went that she had been out trick-or-treating with her friends when she suddenly vanished. No one knew what had happened to her, and she was never found. Every year, someone in my town would claim to have seen her ghost. They said she wandered the streets, still looking for her friends. My friends and I didn't believe in ghosts, but we were curious. So one Halloween, we decided to go looking for her. We walked around the neighborhood, keeping an eye out for anything strange. At first, nothing happened. But then, as we were walking down a dark, empty street, we saw a girl standing by herself. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress and looked out of place. We called out to her, but she didn't respond. Instead, she just started walking away. We followed her, but she turned a corner and disappeared. When we reached the corner, she was gone. There was no trace of her. We were all pretty freaked out and ran home as fast as we could. To this day, I still don't know if what we saw was real or just our imaginations. But every Halloween, I can't help but wonder if she's still out there, looking for her friends. A few years ago, my family hosted a big Halloween party at our house. We invited all our friends and neighbors, and the place was packed. Everyone was having a great time. But then something strange happened. One of the guests, a man I didn't recognize, started acting really weird. He wasn't in costume, which was odd since it was a Halloween party. He was just standing in the corner, watching everyone. He didn't talk to anyone, and no one seemed to know who he was. At first, we thought he was just shy or socially awkward, but then he started following people around the house. It made everyone really uncomfortable. My dad finally went up to him and asked him to leave. The man didn't say anything. He just walked out the door. After the party, we asked all our guests if they knew who the man was, but no one did. We checked with the neighbors, but none of them had seen him before either. It was like he had just appeared out of nowhere. The next day, we found out that a man matching his description had been seen lurking around other houses in the neighborhood. The police were called, but they never found him. We never saw him again, but it still creeps me out to think about how he just showed up at our party and then disappeared without a trace. It was Halloween night, and my friends and I were driving around town, looking for something to do. We had just finished watching a scary movie, so we were all a little on edge. As we were driving down a deserted road, we saw a car pulled over on the side with its hazard lights on. We pulled over to see if the driver needed help. It was an older man, and he seemed really shaken up. He said his car had broken down, and he needed a ride to the nearest gas station. We offered to give him a lift, but as soon as he got in the car, we all felt this overwhelming sense of dread. The man didn't say much during the drive, just kept staring straight ahead. When we got to the gas station, he got out without a word and started walking away. We watched him for a few minutes, but he didn't go into the gas station. Instead, he just walked into the darkness. We were all really freaked out, so we decided to go back to where we had picked him up. But when we got there, his car was gone. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all. We all agreed that it was one of the creepiest things that had ever happened to us, and we never talked about it again. When I was a kid, there was this old abandoned house at the end of our street. Everyone said it was haunted, but no one really believed it. On Halloween night, my friends and I dared each other to go up to the house and look inside. We crept up to the front porch and peered through the dusty windows. At first, we didn't see anything, but then we noticed something moving inside. It looked like a shadow, but it didn't have a shape. It was just this dark, amorphous figure that seemed to be gliding across the room. We all screamed and ran back to the street. We were too scared to go back and look again, but later that night, we told some older kids about what we had seen. They didn't believe us and said we were just imagining things. The next day, we went back to the house in the daylight, hoping to prove that we weren't just seeing things. But when we got there, the house was completely empty. There was no sign of the shadow, and the inside of the house looked like it hadn't been touched in years. We never figured out what we saw that night, but every Halloween, I think about that shadow in the window and wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to see it. Last Halloween, I was home alone, handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. It was getting late, and the kids had mostly gone home, so I decided to turn off the porch light and call it a night. But just as I was about to head to bed, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was distorted, like it was coming through a bad connection. The person just kept repeating the same phrase over and over. I'm watching you." At first, I thought it was a prank, but then they started describing what I was wearing and what I was doing. They even mentioned the decorations I had on my front porch. I was really freaked out and hung up the phone. But they called back, still repeating the same phrase. I tried to block the number, but they kept calling from different numbers. I was too scared to stay in the house, so I grabbed my keys and left. I drove around for a while, trying to calm down. When I got back home, the calls had stopped. I checked the house, but everything seemed normal. I never found out who was calling me, but it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. When I was 13, my parents let me go to a Halloween sleepover at my friend's house. There were about 6 of us, and we were all really excited. We stayed up late, telling scary stories and playing games. But around midnight, things started to get weird. We heard noises coming from the basement, like something was moving around down there. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but then we heard footsteps. We all got really scared, and my friend's older brother went to check it out. He came back a few minutes later, pale and shaken. He said there was nothing down there, but we could tell he was lying. We begged him to tell us what he saw, but he refused. He just told us to stay out of the basement for the rest of the night. We didn't sleep at all that night. Every little noise made us jump, and we were too scared to even leave the room. In the morning, we all went home, and none of us ever talked about what happened again. But I'll never forget the look on my friend's brother's face when he came back from the basement. Whatever he saw down there, it scared him more than anything I've ever seen. A few years ago, my friends and I went to a haunted hayride for Halloween. It was supposed to be really scary, with actors dressed as monsters and ghosts jumping out at you from the dark. We were all excited and ready to be scared. The ride started off pretty tame. There were a few jump scares, but nothing too intense. But then, about halfway through, the tractor pulling the hay wagon stopped. We were in the middle of the woods, with no lights around except for the lanterns on the wagon. The actors were supposed to come out and scare us, but instead, we heard this weird, high-pitched noise coming from the trees. It sounded like someone was screaming, but it was distorted, like it was coming from a long way off. Then, one by one, the lanterns started going out. We all started to panic, but the staff just told us to stay calm. They said it was part of the show, but it didn't feel like it. The noise kept getting louder and closer, and we could see shadows moving in the trees. Finally, the tractor started up again, and we got out of there as fast as we could. When we got back to the main area, we asked the staff what that noise was, but they just shrugged and said they didn't know what we were talking about. We never figured out what happened that night, but it was the scariest hayride I've ever been on.